my meetings, I ask for an audio check. So that's the only reason. Yeah, happy to get going here. So welcome. My name is Bob Powers, and I'm the general manager at BART. And you are in BART's new headquarters, and specifically you are in BART's new boardroom. And so behind me is where we have our BART board meetings, a very democratic process. And every 2 weeks we're in front of the board, and the public is invited to weigh in on topics, to make public comment, and to listen to the back and forth with the board members. And the agendas are published online, so feel free to stop by here. State-of-the-art boardroom, great acoustics, great audio-visual tools in here. And so we're in here every other 2 weeks. I did want to acknowledge the folks, everybody who is watching live streaming and participating with us during their lunch hour. It's much appreciated. And this is going to be a very fun event. So I'm a big reader, and I read all the time. I actually love to read. And I was just telling you, I just finished Jane Eyre, and I'm in the middle of Wuthering Heights. And I do have my copy of this book, Margaret, and I'm going to get to this book. But it's just, reading is just a pastime that I very much enjoy. Michelle and I have often talked about books, and look, it's what better combination, reading and then reading on the BART train. You can't always, obviously, I don't want anybody reading if they're driving anywhere. That's always a bad idea, right? But look, when you're in the BART system, why not? Enjoy a good book and let BART take you very safely and on time to your destination there. And so, BART has embarked on this, one book, one BART effort that we have going on right now, headed up by Michelle from our communications department. And I was part of one 2 months ago, a very well-attended event. And just a few weeks ago, we had the reading on the train, and I couldn't make it, but it was from Richmond to Daly City, and it was like a book club meeting. And, folks who had read the book or just wanted to learn of the book were on the same train car within that train from Richmond to Daly City and back and discussing the book. What a great event. And that you can have more of these, Michelle. Very much in support of those. And it's just a little way that BART is trying to drive our ridership up. And I think you'll see out in the system when you're having these events, the improvements that we've made in the system that are complementary to the events, the book writing events. We've doubled the amount of police presence in the system. And when I say police, it's not just sworn officers. It's crisis intervention specialists, it's ambassadors, it's community service officers. And so Michelle and I will be on the train going to a meeting, and we'll see 2 ambassadors walking down a 6-car train, and that makes us feel good. And we've shortened the trains and made it, kind of strength in numbers. We've improved our on-time performance. We're improving our cleanliness. We're replacing our fare gates system-wide. So all these lines are intersecting right now. And this one book, one BART is just another example of how BART is trying to reimagine public transit in the Bay Area moving forward. So happy to be part of this right now, and just happy that Michelle, you're leading this effort for BART right now, moving forward. And so I wanted to thank everybody. And with that, Michelle, I will turn this over to you for the introductions. And I'm going to keep my book here.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. Hi, I'm Michelle Robertson. I'm the storyteller at BART. And I just want to shout out Bob one more time in his reading. He really is a big reader. We kind of talk about a different book every few weeks, and I'm always impressed, you're the general manager. How do you fit in all the reading? I'm not even reading that much. But I bring this up for a reason, which is that I believe that a general manager who reads is a benefit to all of us, whether you work at BART or whether you ride our trains. Making major improvements to the system, like doubling the frequency of our station deep cleans, as well as our safety presence, requires our staff to be resourceful, innovative, and I'd argue imaginative. Change in our system doesn't happen without someone first having an idea, whether it's Bob, our general manager, and then finding a way to execute it under specific constraints, and that requires imagination. BART has faced some challenges in the last few years, and I've watched our employees routinely rise to the occasion to address them. In doing so, each and every one of them has demonstrated immense creativity, flexibility, and empathy too. So there's a point to all of this. I truly believe that reading has the power to foster and nurture these crucial traits within each of us. The simple act of picking up a book and diving into it challenges our minds and forces us to think outside of the bounds of what's expected, and in some cases, what seems rational. We take the skills and lessons we gain while reading, and we translate them into our everyday lives, including in the work we do at BART. Therefore, I'm grateful the district has supported me in creating this book club. Reading makes us more thoughtful and interesting people, as I'm sure you all know. And reading in community on public transit, no less, is absolutely a gift. So thank you all for being here. I do want to say, if you stay till the end, we're doing the raffle drawing after this. You can also get your book signed by our amazing authors here. So 2 very special BART writers I would like to introduce, as well as literary luminaries. They're both Bay Area authors, and we're so grateful and lucky to have you here today, so thank you. So first up, we have the author of our book club selection this season, the fantastic book On the Rooftop. I encourage you all to buy a copy if you don't already have one. Margaret Wilkerson Sexton is the author of On the Rooftop, as well as the acclaimed novels A Kind of Freedom and The Revisioners. Among many accolades, Margaret is the winner of an NAACP Image Award, the first novelist award from the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and a Janet Heidinger Kafka Prize. Her work has been longlisted for the National Book Award and the Northern California Book Award. She's also published in Ziziva, the Paris Review, the New York Times Book Review, and the Oprah Magazine, to name a few. She lives in Oakland with her family. And our moderator, Vanessa Waugh. She's the author of the national bestseller, Forbidden City, a novel, also for sale back there, which was published last year by Penguin Random House. Forbidden City was named one of the best books of the year by the Washington Post and was longlisted for the Joyce Carol Oates Prize. Vanessa was recently a columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle. She actually wrote a great column about rediscovering the pleasures of BART and public transit, so we thank you for that. She's also a National Endowment for the Arts Literature Fellow, a Steinbeck Fellow, and a winner of the Ronna Jaffe Writers Award. Also, I have to mention this. For Halloween this year, her son was a BART maintenance worker. The costume is incredible. Jumpsuit and BART logo and all of that. He's a big BART fan, so we appreciate the youngsters who are supporting transit. It matters. Well, without further ado, I'll let y'all take it from here. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction, and to all of you for coming and spending this hour with us. I'm so excited to be in conversation with Margaret. I'm a longtime fan of her books, and I think we want to get started with maybe a short reading.
Yeah, I'll read from one of my favorite scenes when Vivian, who's the main character, thank you. Vivian, who's the main character in On the Rooftop, as you may know, I'm not sure how many have already read the mother.
Yeah.
As you may know, I don't know how many have read the book. She fled the Jim Crow South. She arrives in San Francisco expecting a relative reprieve from racism and then is almost immediately disappointed on that front. She marries, she has 2 daughters, and when she's pregnant with her 3rd child, her husband dies. So she has all of this misplaced hope and disappointment, and she needs to funnel it somewhere. And it's 1953 in the Fillmore District in San Francisco. And it's dubbed the Harlem of the West at this time because of the vibrant jazz scene. And so she begins to funnel all these emotions into a dream for her daughters to be singing sensations. Okay, so she, at this moment in the book where I'm gonna read, she's just getting an offer from a manager in the Fillmore who could be the answer to all of the prayers she's had for her girls. He has that kind of connections and power. She took another sip and studied the room once more. The alcohol had cleared her in a sense, and she could see now that even here at Champagne Supper Club, one of the big three in the city, the stage was dusty, the chorus girls' wigs were slanted, their recent baby pooches hanging over their panties. The Johns were losing their patience with the night ladies who took their time. Last week, Vivian had written "Final Act at Champagne" down on a sheet of paper and taped it to the icebox as their next big dream. But now, in the last hour, she had begun to want more for her daughters, a hell of a lot more. And if sending them off was the path there, she would have to let them go. Maybe it was the only opportunity they'd get. She looked up. Yes. What's that, Mr. Franklin asked? Yes, she repeated, feeling like she was coming to. Is that so? She nodded. You got it. It's a deal. She stuck out her hand, and she was glad she had taken the time to polish her nails that evening, cherry red, just like her lips, and he squeezed it tight. He was the type of man who seemed to always get his way, but he appeared surprised now, pleased, but surprised. You're serious, aren't you? He asked, standing. No doubt the other people in the club thought they were forming more than a business alignment. Standing too, she could feel how much she'd had to drink. She had to hold on to the edge of the table before she joined him in an embrace. When she pulled back, he signaled again to the waitress, this time for a round for everybody in the place. I'm managing her daughters, he yelled to all of them, and the chorus girls were still shaking their behinds. They'd taken off their gowns, kicked them flat on the front of the stage, and they leaned toward the audience and shimmied their chests, their overflowing coconut bras jiggling. He's managing my daughters, Vivian called to whoever hadn't heard, and the chorus girls cheered on their way off stage, arm in arm now, snapping their legs up to the ceiling in unison. In the audience, a group formed around Vivian. The news had brought everyone to life. The bored wives, the impatient Johns, the ladies of the night who had shielded themselves all right, shielded themselves 5 drinks deep. By now, these ladies would have celebrated a murder, but luckily it was goodness tonight that called their names. Even the whites stood and clinked their glasses. The band joined on stage and played a tisket-a-tasket, and Mr. Franklin took her hand, and they came together and circled while she kicked her legs in short, quick jerks, and then he extended his arm to swing her out and watched her switch her hips on her own. And then he brought her in again, only to lift her and spin her on his back while the crowd cheered. A lady usher at the church who cooked for Lena's barbecue restaurant accepted the hand of Deacon Washington, and they came together so tight there was no room for Jesus. But everyone was too mirthful to care, and the likelihood was it wouldn't get carried back to Shiloh the next day. And then a John took a lady of the night, and then a man took his own wife, and then a different man took a different man's wife, and the whites didn't know the moves, but they switched their hips to a distinct pulse of their own, and the chorus girls who had been on stage earlier jumped back on and sang. And then the trumpeter switched the tempo, and they weren't playing anything any of them knew. Now it was the saxophonist meeting eyes with the pianist, and the drummer nodding back at the clarinet, and it was Vivian too, and not just her, but all of them, the collective soul of the place. The news Vivian had shared, the John's hopes, the wives' fears, all melding into one frequency. It was driving the sound which was also in their bones, and without realizing it, they were all kicking their feet out at the same rhythm, snapping their bodies into their partners and back out again onto the floor, swerving and hopping and floating, really. And the joy of having formed something streamed through Vivian, lit her up, made her feel like she was shining. And she had had that feeling before when she was married, quick and simple as it was. And when she'd borne each of the girls, of course, she had slipped above the ordinary world for a moment. And then the most recent time, she was at Jack's in the front row, watching her babies sweep a room up into their command. And she'd gone silent for some time, staring in awe. And here it was again now. She could sell this moment, she knew. People would pay everything for it. She would herself, if she could learn to carry it beyond these walls. But for now, it was free, even to the whites, who ventured down to the Fillmore for the barbecue and the blues, and who today, for the first time, had lingered. Thank you.
So that's one of my favorite scenes too.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah, it's so vivid and cinematic, and really sets up what is lost eventually, because this is a novel of gentrification as well. And maybe just I would love to hear what inspired you. I know your first two novels were set in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
This is your first San Francisco novel. You are a historical novelist. What drove you? Was there an image, a song, something that compelled you to work on this book?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Many people don't know this, even people who have read the book, but this story is an adaptation of Fiddler on the Roof. And my mother and I, when I was growing up in New Orleans, we would watch the VHS over and over and over again. My mom was one of these parents who didn't want me to see any kind of R-rated movies. She was okay with violence, but she couldn't handle sex. So we had like a really eclectic mix of movies that I was allowed to watch. It was like The Land Before Time, Terminator, and then
Violence is okay.
right, nothing wrong with that. And and one of them was Fiddler on the Roof, and so we just watched it all the time. We had, we knew all the songs, we could recite the lines, and so she called me one day. I don't remember when it was, but I know it was after Hurricane Katrina, and I'm from New Orleans, so is my mother. And she called and she said, "I have this brilliant idea." And this happens maybe like once every 3 weeks. In fact, it happened yesterday.
With your mother or
With my
what?
mother.
Okay.
Yeah, it happened yesterday. She was at the African American History Museum in DC, and she had a brilliant idea that she texted. And they're not always brilliant, okay? But this one she called about years ago. What I thought it was, she said, "I have this idea. You would base the book on Fiddler on the Roof, except it would be a Black mother, and she would have 5 daughters." Her idea was really literal. It was like she would have 5 daughters. Each one would want to marry someone that the mother didn't approve of. It was very literal. And she said the parallel displacement scene, because we know at the end of Fiddler on the Roof that this community in Anatevka is made to leave their community by the Russian Tsar. She said the parallel displacement would be Hurricane Katrina, and the final climactic scene would be this family standing on their own rooftops with signs saying help, some of the images we were flooded with during Hurricane Katrina. And I thought that was so brilliant. And it was like in my head as something I wanted to do for a while, even like before my first book came out, before I had written that. And but however, I wrote those other 2 books, and they were, as you said, they were set in New Orleans. They both covered Katrina, one of them significantly more than the other, but they both really covered Katrina. And so I felt like, I don't know if I want to get into that again. I also was writing this book during the pandemic, and I was really interested in, because that was such a depressing time, I was really interested in creating a story that would somehow transfer the joy of the characters to the readers. Like I wanted to have this energy transfer that would be uplifting. And I never had that goal for my other 2 books. So I started researching parallel displacements because I didn't want to use the Katrina one, so I needed another one. And I hadn't even heard of the Urban Renewal Program as it affected the Fillmore District in San Francisco. I hadn't even heard of it. But as soon as I came upon it, I was like, this is perfect, because it incorporates the music of Fiddler because we have the vibrant jazz scene. It also is perfect because I was a little hesitant to write about San Francisco. I'm from New Orleans, and it's very easy for me to write about New Orleans. You know, that's my hometown. But I was like, do I really have the authority to write about San Francisco? I've lived in the Bay Area since 2006, but I still don't feel like it's my home, although I love it. So I just felt like, am I stepping on other people's toes? So it was perfect because Vivian, the main character, is from Louisiana. She's also a transplant. So I didn't feel like I was getting out of my lane. And then, you know, I was able to set up this, really, their community was theirs. I was just conveying the facts of their community in the 50s and 60s. And I was able to like establish this sense of kinship that again was there. And that was also in Anatevka in Fiddler on the Roof. So it felt like a really easy transfer.
And that's an amazing story. Does your mom feel like did she kind of take credit for the book?
That's a really good question. I wasn't sure. I could have seen it going either way. I wasn't sure. But what's happened is I'll always be like, Mom, this was your idea. You know, I couldn't have done it without you. I like always say that. And she'll be like, no, this was your book. This was your book. I was going to do a totally different book. This has nothing to do with me. So She tries to revoke the credit. Yeah.
But I do love that On the Rooftop was sort of that seed of it was the image from the first time the idea was conveyed to you, and then it became the title of the book.
I know. That's a good point. That's exactly right. The book was originally called The Roof, but same thing. It came from my mother's vision of this community on the rooftops.
Yeah, and I mean, symbolically, and it's in the novel, they're on the Vivian and her 3 daughters are practicing for hours every day on the rooftop. Like how did that as a place become special for you, for your characters, and symbolically all that it represented?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I was looking at the Victorians that they would have lived in the Fillmore at that time. And I was wondering, you know, these are women who would have been practicing like 3 hours or 4 hours a day because their mother was relentless. And she's a modern day, you would call this person a momager, right?
Or stage manager.
Stage mom. Okay. So I was like, where could they be for these 4 hours? There would be so much happening between these family members during this time. Like that's like some people eat dinner together every night. They're on the roof every night. And so I was just trying to imagine a place where like they could be so connected. They could be fighting, but still maintain the strong family bonds. And I just envisioned this roof on their building.
Is there a building that you I don't know if you scoped out the neighborhood. Is there a particular building where you're thinking this one?
Yeah, well, I had to research like architecture magazines. And there was this one book about Victorians. It wasn't even specific to San Francisco. It was actually Victorians all across the world. And I found a house there in that book. And I was like, okay, this could work. Yeah.
And maybe we could talk about that. And I do want to delve into the themes of the book, but just, I know you're a historical novelist. I feel like we were chatting in the spring and you mentioned a nunnery or something for your next book. So I don't know how many here are fans of historical fiction, but just like what draws you to this genre and, you know, what keeps you excited in this hunt?
It's amazing because I used to work as a lawyer. The reason I left the law firm, one of the reasons, there were many, one of the reasons was because I didn't like research. And then I don't know what happened. I get into this field. I really don't know what happened. I get into this field.
You get to research what you are interested in.
Maybe. I mean, I wouldn't have called. It's funny because A Kind of Freedom, which is like, I think unequivocally called historical fiction. That's my first book. I wouldn't have called it historical fiction, but the publisher did. And you know, it is, now that I think about it retrospectively.
But there's a contemporary strand. Yeah.
Yeah, and I just thought of it as literary. I just didn't think of it that way. And you're right, there is a contemporary strain. So how did I get into the research part? I think it's hard for me to come up with storylines. So I can come up with these amazing themes, like gentrification is a theme, family dynamics. I can do all of that, but it's hard for me to imagine like how that would be conveyed through a story that people would actually want to read. And when I do research, it's not that I'm taking the facts of what happened. It's more like there's this interesting thing that happens where if I read about something that actually occurred, it like sets off a ripple effect in my brain, and I can imagine what might have occurred. It's like just this one source can feed like 5 different strains that are coming out of it, and so I just get my ideas from research, and now it's to the point where I think I depend on that. Like I have never, for novels, I don't think I've ever written one. And I write novels that aren't published all the time. And I don't think anyone has just come from like my brain. It's always based on something I've read historically.
It's a historical multiverse.
Yeah, I like that.
So you mentioned family dynamics, and I wanted to get into that with the 3 sisters and then also the mother-daughter relationships. So we have 3 sisters they're each distinct personalities, yet they still got their period all on the same day, like they're that close. I'm curious, what you think about birth order and how that influences who we become. Actually, Margaret and I both have twins. Mm-hmm. So we were talking about how even like baby A, which is the first twin born, often does remains dominant somehow their entire life. Yeah. So could you talk about birth order and dynamics? And I don't know if your own family, or if you have siblings, or how that plays.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I have a sibling, but he's 25. So I was 16 when he was born, and I only lived in the house with him for 2 years. So he's more like a nephew. We're very close, but he's more like a nephew. So I grew up like totally observing other people's family dynamics, because more than anything, I wanted, quote unquote, a real family. And so I would watch my aunts and uncles who were married and who had 2 kids. This is the idealized family structure. And I would watch how they interacted with each other, how the sisters interacted with each other. And I think I was just watching. I didn't realize how much I was taking in, because I don't have sisters. But for some reason, it's very easy for me to develop characters and to convey characters by like watching them react with their sisters. I even did that in A Kind of Freedom, not intentionally. It's just easy for me to do that. It's like, it feels easy. Like you can see the distinct personality traits if you have someone else to bounce it off of. It's just a really nice tool, I think, to show the reader who's who immediately, because you see them interacting. So there's that. And then you're right, I have these 3 kids. 2 of them are twins. It's to the point that my twins are so competitive with each other that we can't even tell them which one was baby A and which one was baby B, because they would turn that into an argument. And so, but to answer your question, in confidence, of course, baby A is more dominant and is also more of a caretaker, just like Ruth in the book, somehow it's like she's been watching me in the house and she knows how to mirror what I've done. And she does the same thing with her little brothers. I mean, I hate to say little brothers because they're twins, but yeah, I see the middle child dynamic where they sort of feel like they're left out sometimes. And then I see the baby who's adored by everyone and is so easygoing. And I feel to a certain extent that Chloe is like that. We learn more about her later, of course, that she's more complex than she seems. But, not intentionally, I do see the same birth order dynamics that I have in my own house in this book. But it wasn't intentional.
Yeah, I mean, I think often but people wonder if there's this one-to-one correspondence between our lives and how it manifests in fiction, but it just comes out in different ways.
It does. And it's funny because people my family members will always think that I'm writing about them, but I'm not writing about. It's like, no, that actually had nothing to do with you. And they don't catch it when I am writing about them, which is hilarious. And then sometimes, do you ever do this where, like, for instance, I have a cousin who knows how to make pralines really well. And she came to my house to visit me, and she made us all a batch of pralines. And she was showing me how to make them. She didn't know, like, there's no recipe. It's just like her mom was on FaceTime and we were listening to how to make it, put in a little bit of butter. Well, what does that mean? So I was writing a story and I needed to have a scene where something like that was going on. And I just used that scene. I thought it was a really good scene to establish characters. And to this day, I'm frightened that my cousin thinks that the story's about her. It's not about her. It was just a good detail.
Well, because I remember that story. You read it at a Ziziva reading, and the person making the pralines is trying to do so generously, but is a little bit having a hard time in life.
Right, that's right. You have such a good memory. It's true, and this cousin is doing great. Yeah. So I don't ever want her to think that I think she's not. Yeah.
And so that's the sisters. And then what about Vivian? I think what was so interesting in your portrayal is that, sometimes mothers are seen as sort of sainted or one note, but she has these very complex ambitions. And then she's a widow and there's this something with the preacher. Yeah. So could you talk about what it means to write a character like that? Especially your kids obviously aren't the same age as the daughters, but what it means to have a sort of a full-throated mother character.
Yeah, I was just writing an essay about this. Vivian is one of those characters that just came to me. That doesn't always happen. Like sometimes you have to actively chase a character down. Like who is this person? How do I figure out who this person is? This character came to me fully formed. Actually, before my editor touched the book, Vivian comprised 90% of the book. I didn't have the girls having all those sections. They just had these little interludes, but they didn't have their own POV multiple times. Because the story really, to me, was Vivian's story. I think it's different now that the girls have more landscape. But I didn't realize this when I was writing Vivian. I really didn't. I promise you I didn't. But my husband told me after he read a draft, he was like, "Oh, so Vivian's your mom." And I was like, no, Vivian's not my mom. What are you talking about? And he's like, "Oh, okay." So in retrospect, I think that's why she came to me so fully formed. They're different, factually completely different, but the emotional landscape is very similar. My mother, she was a single mom with me, not with my brother. And she was obsessed with once she figured out what my talent was, she was relentless about making sure it happened. And to her, my talent was writing. She figured that out when I was about 13. And she wouldn't let it go. I ended up going to law school, like I told you. When I decided to go to law school, my mother wept. Have you ever heard of that? She's like, "You should be writing this. You're going to regret it." And she still talks about it. But that's just how she is. My brother plays professional tennis and she's his manager, and it's been the same thing. He's been playing since he was 7 years old. It's more her dream than his, just like with Vivian. But she's so effective and powerful and imaginative. I think about Vivian just having the capacity to imagine that for her Black daughters in the 50s, and also the capacity to make it happen. That's my mom. She doesn't know anything about tennis. She just was like, "Oh, he's good at tennis." And then she became a tennis expert. And she now has her own tennis nonprofit where she's teaching kids tennis in New Haven. And that's my mom. And that's Vivian.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So before we turn it over to get questions from the audience, I did want to ask also about gentrification. And especially it's something that resonates today in the Bay Area, and just how you chose to, in some ways though, gentrification in its policies can seem abstract, right? It's this, almost like passive voice, this thing happened to a neighborhood.
That's such a good point.
But you were able to kind of really show the sort of like the hand of the agent coming in to change for, you know, they think it's for the better, but could you just talk about what it meant to, how to wrap your arms around such a complicated issue and turn it into narrative?
Right, that's a great question. Well, I told you I was looking for a parallel displacement to Fiddler on the Roof. I figured that I learned about this particular issue. And I was using this book called Harlem of the West, which I like rave about all the time. It's like the Bible on this particular issue. I haven't seen a book that more thoroughly covers it and more precisely covers it. And I was using that book a lot because it references all the clubs that actually existed, all the performers that would have been going through, all the restaurants, all the bars, et cetera. And it also discusses the gentrification and the urban renewal program and the loss. However, what I noticed about this book is that about 90% of it is the community at its peak. You don't see it. That's why it's such a joyful book, Harlem of the West, because you see the loss, and it's not to undermine the loss, but it's almost just to honor what was. They spend a lot of time on, you know, what the people wore and how nobody locked their doors and everybody was basically family, and, you know, music was playing all night. It spends a lot of time just rooted in the joy and the endurance of that community. And that made it, that actually, I think, affected me more than I knew at the time. It wasn't conscious, but again, I was like, I wanted to honor them more than I wanted to reference the loss and how it happened. Now, I wanted to do that because it's fair to the community and it's fair to the event. But I felt like if I could just focus on this community before it was infiltrated, in a way, it would do it more justice. Yeah.
Yeah, and it would hit harder.
Yeah. And also be like be less of a disservice to the people who were there.
Yeah.
You know, because and I have other books that focus more on the actual oppression itself, but for some reason with this book, I thought it was so important to show the lives, not the oppressors' lives, but this community's lives, you know?
Yeah. Sorry, I just realized I had one more question before we turn over to the audience.
Yeah.
The music.
Oh, yeah.
So did you have the soundtrack playing constantly? And what was it like to try your hand at writing lyrics for girl groups and for like a protest folk song?
Yeah. You know, I didn't mean to write those lyrics. I actually, when I first started the book, I was just using lyrics that existed and of course attributing them to their original authors. But when I moved over, I changed publishers for this book, and the new publisher was a little bit more stringent than my former publisher had been because I had always used lyrics.
Right, but you have to pay a royalty.
Right. And I don't
use more than one line.
Right. So they were like, and you know, there were many, many, many pages of lyrics, and they were like, this isn't going to happen. So you need to get these lyrics off of the page. And I was like, oh, well, you know, that's not fair because so much of this community is about the music. And they were like, well, you know, you can make up your own. And so I was like, okay, I'll try that. I didn't expect it to work. I didn't expect them to be like, oh, this is cool. This works. I was just trying it, and I figured it would be edited out in some way. But, you know, one thing I did think was okay about it was that Esther's lyrics, you know, Esther hasn't won a Grammy, and neither have I. So I feel like we're on the same page, right? I'm writing the lyrics that Esther would be writing.
Yeah.
We're both, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I didn't feel too much like I was stepping outside of my lane. But and then the music otherwise, yeah, I listen to it a lot. I listen to jazz. I listen to a lot of gospel music. I listened to a lot of Mahalia Jackson, Sam Cooke when he was doing the gospel. And that for some reason was really anchoring in terms of like how I could visualize the family in their home, because I just had a feeling they were singing that in their home. And, you know, the church was so important to this family at this time. So, yeah, I definitely was listening to it.
Yeah, there was just a quick thing. With Forbidden City, there was a Chinese poem, and I ran into the same thing where they're like, you can't use a translation, otherwise,
Yeah.
like you have to find a translation like before
Uh-huh.
1906 or I forgot what it was. And so then I tried to look up an out of copyright poem, but then it
Oh.
sounded really archaic. So
Okay.
then I was like, I shall write my version of this
No.
poem.
That's amazing.
Well, it's not it's as poems go, it's not impressive, but it evaded copyright.
That's right.
So we'd love to hear questions from the audience.
So yeah, if you have a question, I welcome you to come up to the podium. Normally this is where people ask our board members questions. So hopefully these are critical in a different way. So yeah, come on up if you have a question. Otherwise, I saw a couple in the chat, but I'd like to kick it off if that's okay. Food. So food is a huge part of the novel, and you have such vivid descriptions, and it seems like so many of like the critical events kind of revolve around these gatherings with food. And I've been obsessed with food and literature since reading Angela Carter in college. And so I want to know, like, how did you, like, why? Why was food such an important part? And how did you kind of approach, like, which foods did you pick and why? Do they have specific symbols or meanings?
Yeah. Well, it's getting tricky because I'm just a foodie. I love food. So it's not even like, oh, I have to stretch myself to get the food into this novel. It's always top of mind. So, but it's getting trickier because I do it in all my books. And so now I'm having to find foods that I didn't name before. And that's getting tricky because they're usually New Orleans food. Yeah, I mean, my aunts are really good cooks. My grandmother was an amazing cook. I have two cousins who are sisters. One has a savory catering company. The other one does these baked goods. They're amazing. I wish I could cook more. I do cook, but it's like because I have these young children and they want to eat the same stuff every day. I think I'm out of practice, but yeah. So it's just always top of mind. I will tell you this funny story. You know Rachel Kong?
Yes.
Okay, and she really is a foodie, and she really is
A food writer.
a food writer. Yeah. So she's in my writing group, and she was reading one of these sections. And I was having Ruth make something. I can't remember what it was, but it was something I had never made before myself. And this was just a draft going to the writing group. And she was quiet for like most of the meeting. She didn't say anything. And then she like raised her hand to say something. And you could tell she was like tiptoeing around it. And finally she was like, is Ruth supposed to be a bad cook or? And I was like, no, they're all good cooks in the family. And I was like, why? And she was like, that's not how you would make the collard greens. Yeah. And so, yeah, that was hilarious. But
That's why you need writing community.
That's exactly right. So, but no, I'm always going to be writing about food. Yeah.
Oh, there's a hand in the back.
Oh, please, Ada. Do you want to come up or you want to project?
No, I'll just project. You mentioned doing research about Harlem of the past. In your research, you went to San Francisco and looked around.
Oh, yeah.
So would you be able to share with us what is left?
I just wrote an essay about this too. So I wrote many drafts before going, and I did that on purpose because, again, I wanted to really envision the community at its height. We know that many homes were destroyed. We know that in their place there was a highway built, many commercial buildings, homes that are too expensive for really for anybody, but especially for that community that was there. We know that most of them were never able to return. And we know that much of the Black community now in San Francisco is, well, I'm not going to say most, that's not true. We know that much of the Black community in San Francisco has been significantly disempowered. And I think I think I don't think the link between much of what's affecting us now in San Francisco, I don't think the link between that and these kinds of programs is that indirect. I think we can trace it.
Yeah, and the Black population has been shrinking for decades. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Have you lived there for a long time? Okay. So you've seen, yeah. So some of the people I interviewed, one of them in particular, Charles Collins, do you know? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So he was a child there, and then he left when maybe he was like 10. And this would have been in the 60s. He went to DC. They came back like 10 years later. And, that was a very powerful 10 years for that community. Like, he didn't even recognize it. But I will say that for most of the people I interviewed, they didn't like harp on, just like the Harlem of the West book, like they didn't harp on like, they talked a lot. Their eyes would light up talking about the time that they lived there and that it was good. I noticed that and I was surprised by that. I was expecting the conversation to be more focused around the loss, but it really was like, oh yeah, I remember that. And a lot of the conversations were really positive.
Turn it over. This is a fun question. This is from a BART employee in the Office of the General Counsel. So your lawyers are still out here supporting. This book seems like it would be a good musical play or a musical. Is that in the works?
I don't know that a musical play is in the works. I think that the book will be transferred to another medium. I don't know if it'll be a musical play. I don't know, if it were a musical play, it would surprise me based on what's happening right now. However, I do think I think about other books that have been movies and then plays. I think anything is possible. And I think setting it up, adapting it so with Fiddler in mind, it kind of opens the door for, it's just like an easier transfer. I feel like they wouldn't have to do much to adapt this for the stage.
That Grammy could still be coming.
Yeah, you're right.
Or Tony.
For me and
Academy
Esther,
Award.
yes.
One more from the chat. Underneath the Harlem Moon begins and ends the book. Why was that song chosen to be so significant to the mom and daughters?
Oh, that's a really good question. And now keep in mind, I do remember this particular piece, but keep in mind, I wrote this book came out in 2022. When did I write it? 2020. So, I'm reaching back. At that time, I remember I was just researching the music scene at that time, and there were these 4 sisters. I'm blanking on their name. It was like the Alabama something. I'll have to look it up, but there were these 4 sisters. They were Black women. They were very light-skinned, but they were Black women, and they referred to themselves as Black. They weren't passing, and they would go to these homes and perform for white people, and they would be singing one of the songs they sing is Underneath the Harlem Moon, and they'd be singing these really sad songs, smiling with these huge smiles like that. And I just couldn't get that out of my head. And I thought that might be a pivotal scene for Vivian to have witnessed, because it ends up being that she's working with her mom one day, and there are these performers. It's actually the seed for the Salvations, because she sees these girls who are sisters performing. And I just thought it would be a really cool nod to the dynamics of that. Just like going into a white home where you have to walk in through the back, and you have to pretend to be happy for people singing about something that's so tragic, especially personally tragic. I just thought that would be a really good nod to the times. And then I felt like that would be organic to Vivian's journey into this whole thing in the first place.
Wow, great question.
That is a really good question. Nobody's ever asked that.
Any other questions from the audience before we do something? Oh, please.
I have a short question about the life. You said that you left the law firm.
Oh, yeah.
This is really rare to people, you know, and all of us get some passions when we were teenagers, but most of us stay in corporations all our life. Of course, you're lucky to have such mom who believed in you
Yeah,
from
that's
the
true.
beginning. But can you please tell us about this journey? Was it a safe job, or you just went to nowhere and then you found your passion?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I was working at a law firm during the legal recession, and we started off extremely busy, you know, sometimes working 20 hours a day. It was terrible. But then gradually, there would be less and less work, and it turned out that was even more terrible. So we were always like on edge about layoffs because layoffs had started at other companies, at other firms. So at this time, my particular firm and many firms on this tier, I think, were embarrassed to have to lay their employees off. So they created this incentive program for people to leave and essentially receive severance. You know, it's a portion of their salary. The way they worded it was it would be a portion of your salary. You would leave for a year and pursue your dream. It was really called Dewey Pursuits. And you would leave for a year, pursue your dream, and then you'd come back and be a lawyer. But it was really, it was really just severance. They just needed people to leave. So that program ran for years, actually. And for a long time, I didn't want to get into it because I had just started. You know, I only worked as a lawyer for about 3 years. So I was like, I was committed to it once I went in. Although I had always wanted to be a writer, I was committed to it because I had gone to law school and taken the bar. So gradually, it became clearer and clearer that it wasn't a good fit at this particular firm. Although, to be honest, I really liked being a lawyer, but it wasn't a good pick. It wasn't a good fit at this particular firm. That became, you know, more and more painfully obvious by the day. And I remember, I'd be walking down the hallway. It was this very dark hallway in this firm. It was in the South Bay in Palo Alto, right next to the Four Seasons. And it was this very dark hallway. And I would hear this voice saying, "You're not supposed to be here." And that started like as soon as I walked in that office, literally as soon as I walked in, and it went on for years. And you know what happened? I had no intention of leaving, but I got married, and I was sitting in the rehearsal dinner, and you know how people will give toasts at the rehearsal dinner? People were saying the nicest things about me. I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. I could just feel myself getting bigger and bigger, like just more confident, you know, in a positive way every time someone went up. And it was really strange. I'm telling you, before the rehearsal dinner, I was prepared to go back to work on Monday and just keep working there. It was something about what people were saying at that dinner where I was like, you know what? Maybe I am what they're saying, and maybe I can take this risk. And I always say I had the luxury of, you know, that was my wedding, so I was getting married. My husband was working a 9-to-5 job, and, you know, I was getting the severance. So we didn't have kids at that time. So it wasn't, you know, it wasn't as much of a risk as it would have been later. And then I ended up getting pregnant with twins, and I was like, you know, I might as well just write at home and take care of them because childcare is so expensive anyway. And then it just kind of went on from there. Yep.
Oh, yeah, please.
What did you learn about yourself?
Oh, that's such a good question. What did I learn about myself? Well, this is really transparent, but I learned that, you know, my first 2 books they weren't as light. Do you know what I mean when I say that? This book is a little bit lighter.
Or it's just the focus was on joy.
The focus was on joy. The focus was on joy. And I loved that. I did love that. And I think it was good for the time, especially the pandemic. And, you know, those books also sometimes tend to be more commercial sometimes. I learned that I do really enjoy wading into the mire. Like I think with my next project, I'm going to go much deeper. And I don't want to say much darker, but much more heavier. Yeah. So, and I think that's just what I like.
Well,
Oh, so I just have a quick speed round if we don't have any more questions.
I'm like frightened of this a
No.
little.
There is no right answer.
Okay, okay.
Okay. Fiddler on the Roof or Hamilton?
Fiddler on the Roof.
Okay. First car or middle car of the BART train?
Oh, middle.
Okay.
Yeah.
Favorite BART station?
Rockridge.
Okay. And the final question, is Baby Love or Please Mr. Postman?
Oh, that's a good one. Baby Love.
Okay.
But they were even. I really could have gone with either.
Okay.
That's really fun.
Yes.
I like that. I thought it was going to be like, I didn't know it was going to be choices. I thought it was going to be like the first word that comes to your head,
Oh, right.
which would have been terrifying, right?
Okay, well, but thank you so much.
Thank you
Love this
so
conversation.
much.
Thanks to all of you.
So thank you, you two wonderful people. That was so cool. Like, I can't believe we get to do this at BART, and I'm so glad you're our inaugural authors. That was really interesting. Raffle. We can't forget the raffle. Jill, could I ask you to bring up our raffle ticket? Every literate, author talk should have a raffle, right?
Absolutely.
So I'm going to also invite the authors to go take a seat at the right-hand table. We're going to clear it off for you so you can sign some books. So please buy their books and get them signed. Okay. Oh, thanks, Jill. 724-328. There you go. You win a t-shirt.
Very cool.
There. Nice. Awesome. Well, thanks again, y'all, and I appreciate it.